We should be at the end of the Old Testament by the end of this evening, but just to, be in the habit of recapping what it is that we're trying to do and the ground that we've already covered. Hi, Rich. So remember, this is about trying to get our heads round. Oh, can you hear me all right? Do I need to use this? You can hear me fine? Yeah. Good. Diolch, Dad. Trying to get our heads around how the whole Bible fits together. I've been out for lunch, so I did not bring my set of individual books of the Bible all separated out. But how is it that all of these books, approximately 66, how do they fit together? Well, why are they connected? How do they form something that we call the Bible? Or another way of sort of thinking about it, what is the story of the entire thing? How does it go from origins in Genesis in the garden to Revelation and the garden and the city together, heaven on earth brought together? What is it that sort of ties it together, tracing the story? Because I think we discussed this a little bit last month, where when you start the New Testament, when Jesus appears on the scene, the scriptures are absolutely drenched in stuff that comes before that. So if you literally turn to Matthew, which is usually the first book of the New Testament, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Well, all of a sudden you've got two questions there, haven't you? Who the heck is David? Who the heck is Abraham? Why does it matter that this guy's related to either of them? But if answering those questions wasn't enough, you've then got verse after verse after verse after verse of various other names. The majority of which, I think, if you had your detective cap on and your magnifying glass out, you could go and you could cross-reference, or nowadays in our computer age, you can jump on Bible Gateway, whatever software you use, and you type in and it'll show you all the references to such and such in the thing. But page 1 of the New Testament sort of assumes that you already know the story up until that point. So we sometimes have this attitude, well, you come, and what it is we're just trying to really introduce you to Jesus, and you need to know Jesus, and that's what's really important. Utterly agreed. But even then, the materials that we use to introduce people to Jesus assumes that they've already, understood, or at least ingested and digested a bit more of the Old Testament scriptures. Matthew is like that. The Gospel of Mark begins not in a similar fashion. It doesn't have the genealogy. Let me just find it. But it speaks about the beginning of the good news of Jesus the Messiah, which is a word we're familiar with, but it's a particularly lauded word, the Son of God, and then goes on to reference Isaiah, and I think it's Isaiah and Malachi. Yeah, there you go. And so, sort of understanding what's going on in this bit, really, really, really important for understanding this bit. In our home groups, we're looking at the moment at the letter to the Hebrews, and quotations from the Psalms and the Old Testament, references to various stories, allusions, they are just turned up to 11. It's, maximal impact. Every sentence bears like some sort of link back to the old stories, the old scriptures, the old instruction, the old law. So as people who want to know Jesus more and presumably appreciate the importance and the power of the Bible, we're trying to figure out how the story all fits together, which bits come where, who relates to whom, which events and things like that are key and controlling in our thinking. So that's what we've been doing, month to month, slowly sort of pulling books out of my little collection and looking at them, not one at a time, but grouped at a time. If you remember, we started off looking just at Genesis. The story from Adam until Israel, literally the man called Israel, Jacob, and his family went down to Egypt. That's where the book of Exodus starts. And we spent the first session looking at Adam and the story of humanity as a whole until Abram. Then how the focus changes from humanity as a whole to this one family, from Abram to Joseph, and Joseph, how they ended up down there in Egypt. And drawing out, we did that first session, we drew out loads of things, like how important gardens were, not just as like a description of the first place that humans dwelt, but how things like trees and the peaks of mountains, high places, because later on we understand that Eden was, or the garden in Eden was the peak of a tall mountain. How wells seem to play a regular sort of thing happening in story after story. How Egypt had some sort of importance. And that throughout the story there were people that arose. First Adam and Eve, then Noah, then Abraham and all of his descendants, then Joseph as a key figure towards the end. And just looking at creation, fall, flood, covenant made with Noah and the covenant made with Abraham. And then, sort of, as we're thinking about it this evening, an exile taking place. Jacob and his family having to go down into Egypt to survive and to exist. The second session, we moved on from the book of Genesis to the book of, but more than that, the concept of the story of the Exodus. So, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Which way round do they go? I can't remember. Shemai. And the story of how the people are brought up out of Egypt, rescued from that place where they're in bondage, they're under slavery, where they're being literally slaughtered. You know, a new Pharaoh rises up, doesn't remember Joseph, doesn't have the same respect for Joseph and his family as the old pharaohs did, and ordered that all baby boys should be killed, drowned in the river. And there's the amazing events of the plagues, the burning bush with Moses, the crossing of the Red Sea, into the wilderness times, and how God takes the people and binds himself to the people. The 10 Commandments are given, the promises are given, the covenant is given. But mixed in with all this wonderful giving from God to the people was a tremendous amount of rebellion. When Moses is up the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments, the people are down the bottom crafting for themselves a golden calf. Or when they're on the shores of the Jordan, about to enter into this promised land, the spies have gone out, the people want to go home. And home to them is Egypt, not the place that God has promised to deliver them into. God gives them the tabernacle, and he gives them basically everything that they need in the wilderness. Then month 3, still really slow moving for such a big number of books. We've gotten through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Is that the right way around? Why do I keep getting the Deuteronomy, Numbers? I can't remember. No, it's Numbers, Deuteronomy. What I was calling the conquest. So now the if you like, the people being stopped from going into the promised land because of their multiple rebellions, that time has passed. It's a new generation. Moses dies, and Joshua leads the people across the River Jordan. And it's familiar too how the people crossed the waters, went through the waters when God rescued them out of Egypt. It's a significant event. When they're in the land, they settle in the land, the manna from heaven stops. They are there. God fights battles for them, gives them victories. They fill it, they settle in it, but it's by no means the end of the story, even though it could be the end of the story. You'd think that the story might go, Adam and Eve kicked out, their descendants go as far away as Egypt into oppression, and God says, right, I'm going to bring you, I'm going to whisk you, I'm going to bring you back to Eden, I'm going to bring you back to the promised land, and that's where we finish. But then you get a book like the book of Judges, which goes to show that the people never really wanted to go that far, because God had given them certain commands, God had given them certain criteria to fulfill, and time again they turn their back on God. They wander, they go their own way, they're led astray by the people who are already there in the land. Things go badly. We've had a couple of discussions, haven't we, how like the way of God, the way that Yahweh invites the people to walk and to follow him in, are ways that lead to life, but in rebellion they keep on choosing ways which in their own eyes looks good, their own eyes looks better, but it keeps on leading to death. So you have the conquest, going in, taking the land, the cycle of rebellion and judgment and judges, rescuers coming to help the people when they cry out to God, until you get to a story like the story of David, where the people decide, you know what, we don't want this on repeat cycle anymore. We want a king to rule over us. We want a king like all of the other nations. And in one sense, that is its own rebellion. But in another sense, it's an opportunity for God to be gracious to his people, to give them what they don't deserve, and to give them someone, a person, who can lead them, can help them overcome their enemies, and can point them towards righteousness. And David sort of fulfills that role, but it also introduces into our collective consciousness and thinking that there will be an individual that's been promised and spoken about in loads of different ways up until this point, but there will be an individual who is going to come, who is going to rescue, who is going to lead, who is going to defeat the enemies, who is just going to be the one that puts everything right. And immediately after David's reign, again, we're at another point where you think, well, that might be the case. You've got Solomon, who builds this wonderful temple. And when they dedicate the temple, the glory, the presence of the Lord shows up, and it's overwhelming. They can't approach it. They can't go near it. It's just there. It's awesome. It's wonderful. And people from all around, all sorts of nations, are just amazed at this kingdom and its king. Do you remember? We were looking specifically at Solomon, and God asked him, well, what is it that you want me to do for you? You're the king now. You've got this responsibility. What is it that you want me to do for you? And unlike almost every single character we've met up until this point, Solomon says, well, what I really want is help from you to do the thing that you've called me to do. And it's specifically linked to wisdom. I want you to tell me, God, what is right and wrong. I want you to guide our paths. I want you to be the one that leads us into life. The precise opposite of what happened at the fall when you think about it. This fruit is good and useful for knowing what is good and evil. It's a wisdom tree that they go to, and they've been told, don't eat of that yet. But they want to snatch wisdom for themselves. That's where it all unravels. So Solomon comes in, these wonderful things, this place of worship, this place of prayer, the temple that's been built. He's got this pure heart, not selfish, not self-important, not choosing and asking things for his own good, but for the betterment of everyone that God has appointed him to rule over. And it's a crescendo in so many ways, but also it's the beginning of the end, because we know more things about Solomon than he had wisdom that abounded. He also had wives that abounded, and political alliances that abounded. And just in every way that he's a positive example, you can find a counterpoint where he is the ultimate compromised human being. And the judgment that came on that compromise. And judgment, remember, I think we've also covered this, isn't always just like the guilty verdict and the punishment handed out by God. It's like when you're walking a public footpath and you see signs that say, trespassing, keep out. And the public footpath has got the markers telling you what the right way is. When you decide not to follow that way and to go off on your own way, there are different things that happen. First of all, the farmer will come and he will shoot you with his gun. That is one thing that could happen. You've transgressed, so whatever punishment comes, that's what you'll do. But also, if it's a good footpath, it'll be a footpath that's leading you nowhere near dangerous cliffs or brambles or wild beasts or babbling brooks that can't be crossed. And if you go off the path, there's just the natural result that you're going to find yourself in places that aren't made for humans to walk and that they're dangerous. And so the result of Solomon and his compromise is as much judgment from God as it is consequences of going your own way. But there's civil war, there's a split that happens, and this is what we were looking at last month. The descent of the kingdom of Israel. We'd had this high point that had been reached with Solomon, but then we have the division, the civil war. We have wicked kings after wicked kings. We have prophets all over the shop who are there speaking on behalf of God to the people, warning them what will happen if they carry on their current course, inviting them to a better life, to a better present, to a better future. And we finished off last month looking at the defeats that happened. First for the northern kingdoms, the 10 tribes, and then for the southern kingdoms, of how they are overtaken and they're taken away by foreign superpowers. So that is the recap. That is where we are. And this is what we're going to be thinking about this evening, is the period known as the exile. So there's lots of words that we sort of like band around, and they're really useful things to remember as believers. So like when I say Exodus, you're not supposed to just think of the book of Exodus. You're supposed to think of the entire story. And when you think about exile, you're supposed to think about this and other stories that link in with it in the Bible, that cover multiple books in the Bible. They cover multiple generations of people, lots and lots of characters involved. But I did wonder, just so that someone else can have a turn speaking, if anybody's got any loaded information already in their minds about what exile is. In the Bible, where do we see exiles and what do they generally communicate to us? Anybody? You cut off the familiar. Yeah, okay, I like that. Yeah. The phrase I've always used is being away from home. So that would be, cut off. It is quite a deliberate description as well. So something has intentionally happened, which is, in my softer language, meant that you're away from home. Yeah, cut off from the familiar. Any examples of exile in the scriptures? Other than, you're not allowed to say when the Israelites are taken into Babylonian captivity. The exile. Yes. Yeah, so that doesn't make it into the nativity plays very often, does it? Yeah, it would make it a bit long. But the warning comes that Herod is going to kill all of the baby boys under 2. So at night, Joseph takes Mary and baby Jesus, and is it until he's like 10? Something like that, 10 years or something, they go and they live in Egypt. Yeah. So Jesus is in exile for the first part of his life. Yeah. Any other examples?
I like the story of the little girl taken by the Syrians into exile during the days of election.
Mm-hmm.
And unlike Israel suffering, or Judah suffering in Babylon, that she was a testimony and told Naaman and Master, well, not Master's wife, that there was a God in Israel who could heal his leprosy. I like that story.
Yeah, it is a smashing story. So that's not like the exile of the whole people. There was, an individual taken, a slave, and the slave master becomes ill. It's leprosy, isn't it, in the story, or a skin disease, what have you. And she says to her captor, there's help that's available to you. You just got to go back to where I'm from. And he does go back, and he is healed. And weird part of the story, even takes a little bit of soil home with him. It's not that weird if we could have been drawing this kind of theme out as well, but literally the land is important in the biblical story. Yes, well, yes, indeed, yeah. But he'd come to, through what happened, trust in the God of this place, and the soil sort of signified that or embodied that for him. Yeah.
I understood that, as you said this morning, how she could have asked, how on earth have I come to this point?
Yeah.
And then she said, a man, a life, and we don't know.
Any other thoughts, either of example stories or just like conceptually? Exile is us. Carry on.
We're meant to be citizens of heaven and we don't belong in the world, do we?
Yeah.
So we're not at home.
Yeah. And Paul sort of gives a little bit of language to that, doesn't it, when he can see a bleak future for himself, humanly speaking, in jail. He's writing to the Philippians and he says, look, I don't know if I'm going to live or die. If I die, it's gain. If I live, it's Christ. Meaning, if they take my life away, well then, good. I get to go home. I get to be at home with my Father. If not, then I stay in this foreign place for a time, and I get to, like this slave girl, get to proclaim Christ to my captors. But yeah, that is exactly the picture. And loads of the New Testament writers use the imagery. Peter does explicitly that language, calls us exiles. James does, he writes to the dispersed as well, people who are cut off and spread out. So lots of the examples of being cut off from the familiar, or as I would put it, being away from home, we do quite often link with judgment. And there is a number of stories where it is linked to judgment. So, where does being cut off begin in the Bible? Adam and Eve. And it's clearly a judgment. They are cast out from God's presence because they have rebelled. But that's not the case for Joseph. Joseph, we can say whatever we want about whether he was wise in how he spoke to his brother, he did this. But it wasn't just judgment that he was first thrown into a pit and then sold to the caravan of Ishmaelites, or I can't remember who it was, Midianites, and then sold into slavery in Egypt as well. Exile was just something that happened to him because of the actions of other people. Our friend from 1 Kings, 2 Kings, in the time of Elisha, is another example. I don't think there's any indication there that she's out of the picture, that she's had to go elsewhere, cut off from the familiar because of anything wrong she's done, but she is far away from home. I think one of the greatest pictures of exile is the eternal Son stepping down from glory and becoming a human. Jesus descending, humiliating himself even to the point of suffering alongside us. It's a story of him being exiled. And it's not because he's been judged. He's deliberately making that step in order to do something special. And one of the fun things, I think, from all of the stories of exile in the Bible is that, be they, tightly, directly linked to judgment, or this is just what's going on, it's the result of sin, but somebody else's sin perhaps, God is the sort of God who is always achieving his purposes through them, through the exile. So, for example, thanks for bringing that up, Yvonne. I'm going to keep on going back to that. This girl going to, what's the officer called? Naaman, is used. Joseph, one of the most famous, story roundups in the entire Bible. You all meant this for harm. God meant it for good and the saving of many lives. I was exiled so that you could all live. Jesus. It wasn't accidental coming to dwell amongst us. It wasn't a punishment to come and dwell amongst us, but it was to achieve something. So just keep that in mind as we have a look at.
Could we also mention John he was an exile, wasn't he? Which again is a great blessing to the church.
Yeah, absolutely.
Again, through no fault of his own.
Yeah, indeed. So he'd been exiled, imprisoned on Patmos, wasn't it? Yeah. So just keep those sorts of thoughts, those ideas in mind as we start to contemplate the sort of the final movement in the Old Testament period story history, which are the exile of the people, which we read about, but we'll read one description of them going out again, and the return, okay? And we're going to think about it in those two things, life in exile and then the return. So if you've got a Bible, let's just remind ourselves, it's 2 Chronicles 36. Just remember, this was one of the history books making its way through the kings, king by king, kingdom by kingdom, reviewing what sort of king they were, a king that followed in the footsteps of David, or a king that promoted idolatry and all manner of evil. 2 Chronicles 36, and I'm just going to read from verse 15 down to verse 20, I think. The Lord, their God of their ancestors, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. As in, this is the real time of the prophets, God warning them, God pleading with them, God calling them back, saying, this is what will happen if you carry on this course. Come back to me with all your hearts. But it says that they don't listen to him. Verse 16, they mocked God's messengers. They despised his words. They scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary and did not spare young men or young women, the elderly or the infirm. God gave them all into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar. And he carried to Babylon, not just the people, he carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and all the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple, broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value there. And then it says he carried into exile to Babylon the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his successors until the kingdom of Persia came to power. It's actually quite an interesting detail that's included there, that what goes first into exile isn't the people, but it's the items from the temple. Now that might just strike us as being a bit of a random thing to do, or maybe it's just a thought that here's some they're all made out of gold and silver and bronze and all of this sort of stuff. So here's the stuff of value, here's the treasure. If you're going to go and wreck a place, then you might as well steal all of their treasure as well. Actually, the list of things that are taken, recorded in other places, is the exact list of things that is returned. And they're not just random bits and bobs. They're not just random trinkets. We can keep a record of the various things that we've got in the church kitchen. We've got the cutlery for when we have the big meals. We've got the cups that we bought for Coffee, Cake and Company. We've got the new plates that stack on top of each other for Coffee, Cake and Company, so that there's sort of 3-tier cream tea sort of vibe going on. And they're just sort of like little random bits and bobs. But these are items, these are devices that are used in the temple, the place where heaven and earth meet, the place where God dwells amongst his people, the place where you go to make atonement for sin, but also, as John was describing this morning, wasn't he, things like the fellowship offering, where you just go to be thankful, to go to be grateful and to celebrate, the place that you go to be with God. So the items that are being taken away are the things which are used in and in some way represent communion with God or God's presence with them. In the book of Jeremiah, there's a description of him seeing the glory of God depart in the temple, the glory of God leaving, and you think, well, in one sense, that's a horrendous thing to have happened. That the glory had come when it was consecrated after Solomon had built it, and now the glory is up and left. What a judgment on the people. But when you stop and you think about it, it's also a description of God going ahead of them. That he knows exactly where it is that they're going to be exiled to, and it's clearly a judgment for their rebellion, and yet God in his goodness, God in his kindness, goes and prepares a way. That when they are going, cut off from the familiar, away from home, God has said, in essence, God has gone to be there first, to be there waiting for them, to welcome them, to be with them. So we shouldn't expect, when we read the story of life in exile, which is primarily found in the book of Daniel, we shouldn't expect it to be a life that's devoid of God and that's utterly hopeless. We should expect, because of this description, because of what Jeremiah saw, the glory departing and going ahead of them, going to Babylon, that actually they might, even in that far-off place, discover something about God, grow in God, and actually enjoy his presence, even though they're not in the place where they're supposed to be. Does that make sense? So let's have a look at Daniel. Yeah, go for it. 36. 2 Chronicles 36. So let's have a look at Daniel. So one of the things that happened was that in order basically to get the entire empire to run well, they would take sort of well-to-do people, the upper sorts in society, and they would retrain them to be good Babylonians and then put them to work across the empire so that everybody felt that they were represented, no need to rebel. Everybody felt that it was it was their place where they lived. Think about it, it's a very clever thing to do. And so the Israelites were no different. When they were captured, when they were taken into exile, a group of them were sort of skimmed off the top, and they were trained up to be Babylonians. And I think it was during the lockdown we were looking at the story of Daniel in some depth. But does somebody want to just read Daniel chapter 1 down to verse 7? Can't see. Do you want me to turn the light on? I closed that to stop this because the sun was coming in and it was getting really hot and I was sweating even indoors. Better? Oh, I've lost my page now. Where was I? Come on. Daniel chapter 1, 1 down to 7. Yes, please.
The chief official gave them new names: Belshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
So that's sort of the description of the assimilation that's going on. They've been whisked off, and, you know, like I say, to make these people compliant, I don't know, in general, take a bunch of them, indoctrinate them, turn them into like good and true and proper Babylonians, get them to reign with you, and then everyone will feel represented and feel comfortable. So, knowing why they've gone into exile, and knowing sort of what the plan is for them in exile, how would you think life goes? Or what would you expect, you know, the Bible's lesson to be for you, good believer, how you should live in this sort of circumstance? Any thoughts?
Well, some of them actually knuckled down, and they did well. It's not like they didn't want to go backwards, but, you know, the descendants and the people.
Yeah.
And after all, Jeremiah said you should pray for all the nations that you're in. So there was I suppose they couldn't understand God's way, but they understood what some of them had to see what we are here.
Well, we're going to look at what Jeremiah instructs them to do in a second. Yeah.
But they picked them from certain
Families. Yeah.
society that were more handsome,
Mm-hmm.
well educated. So, you know, but then if they were Hebrews, they were from the tribe of Judah, I would have thought they would have been taught from quite a young age the scriptures anyway. I mean, I don't know how old they were when they went.
Well, we know that the people have had a history up and down like that anyway. So sometimes the scriptures were valued, and sometimes they weren't just sidelined, they were utterly unknown. You know, they had to be rediscovered. People say, well, what are these things that we've got? They didn't follow necessarily. But by all means, let's assume that, you know, the grass is, there is the silver lining, that they are thinking people, Jewish people. How might we expect them to live and respond in this scenario, or how might we expect life to be in exile for them? What would our sort of like just natural instincts be?
Some of them, but I think they would have felt under pressure, particularly these lads, because Daniel obviously, and the other three, obviously knew in their heart of hearts that they were different.
Mm.
In Babylon, not all Babylon.
Mm.
And they might have even remember the prophets of Leviticus, where the Lord said to them, you will go into exile for 70 years. Who knows?
Mm.
Has anybody lived in
I was in England for a couple of years. It was definitely different. I asked for half and half once in a restaurant and they didn't know what I was on about. Half and half. I was ordering a chilli and they said, rice or chips? And I said half and half, and they looked at me like I had three eyes.
Well, we live in Scotland and there's lots of things that are different.
But, right. So you'd expect that to be the case, wouldn't you? Yeah. That's one of the things I was speaking about this morning, wasn't it? If you just want an easy life, just go along with the flow. Go with how the world is. Like, don't try and rub up against it in any way. If what you're after is the easiest life possible, then just do what you're told, keep your head down, happy days. But, just me trying to load the gun a little bit for us, that we know that people of God are supposed to stand out, aren't they? They're supposed to be different. You know, they've gone in, they've taken the land, they've been warned. Don't be anything like those people in the land. Rid the land of them and their practices and things like that. Don't be led astray by them. This is the way that you're supposed to live. Don't live like them. They didn't listen and now they're in exile. So I'd think that would be doubly in their mind. Oh, well, we're really in it now. We're having the punishment for living like the people who we were amongst. God's put us somewhere else, in many senses, a more barbaric, more oppressive people than we've ever known before. Now we've really got to double down if we've got any hope of going home and sticking to our guns. And that would make life hard for them. For an awful lot of people, that would make life really, really hard. So, if you carry on reading chapter 1, there's a sense in which that's exactly what they do. These boys are not to be just, the wool pulled over their eyes. They stand up. Verse 8, Daniel, Belteshazzar, resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and so he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. God had caused the official to show favour and compassion to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food. Treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. Oh, it's so hard not to just want to preach a sermon from something like that. Because you've got exactly that, haven't you? You've got them immediately wanting to stand out, wanting to cut against the grain, wanting to say, right, well, we're in this position, but we aren't going to live just like you. Trusting themselves to God. I love the description of the Lord God had caused the official to show favour and compassion to Daniel. So we know already in the story, they're not abandoned in exile. We know that was true for Adam and Eve as well. They continued to have fellowship with God outside of the garden. So there is this sense of standing up, of living apart. But you were mentioning Jeremiah. So Jeremiah was one of the prophets who was preaching before the exile and then through the exile. And in Jeremiah, I hope it's Jeremiah 29. I think it's Jeremiah 29. He writes a letter to the exiles. There it is. That's the title in my translation. And it's a letter instructing them how they should live. Would somebody be willing to read... Read verse 4, which is where the letter starts, Read the whole thing, verse 4 down to 23. Jeremiah 29, verse 4 down to 23. Anybody willing to read that? Anybody willing to read half of it? You'd read a bit? Okay, Rach, will you read from verse 4 down to and including verse 14? And then would somebody else take over? Becky, from verse 15 to the end of it? To the end of the letter, so verse 23.
This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Sorry, Beck.
Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there and do not decrease. Also seek peace and prosperity in the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name, and I have not said them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. You may say the Lord has raised up prophets for us in Babylon, but this is what the Lord says about the king who sits on David's throne, and all the people who remain in this city, your fellow citizens who did not go with you into exile. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I will send the sword, famine, and plague against them, and I will make them like figs, that are so bad they cannot be eaten. I will pursue them with the sword, famine, and plague, and will make them abhorrent to the kingdom of the earth, a curse and an object of horror, of scorn and reproach among all the nations where I drive them. For they have not listened to my words, declared the Lord, words that I sent them again and again by my servants the prophets. And you exiles have not listened either, declares the Lord. Therefore, hear the word of the Lord, all you exiles whom I have sent away from Jerusalem to Babylon. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says about Ahab, son of Kaliah, and Zedekiah, son of Messiah, who are prophesying lies to you in my name. I will deliver them to the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he will put them to death before your very eyes. Because of them, all the exiles from Judah who are in Babylon will use this curse. May the Lord treat you like Zedekiah and Ahab, whom the king of Babylon burned with fire. For they have done outrageous things in Israel. They have committed adultery with their neighbours' wives, and in my name they have told lies, and it's not organised. I know, and I am a witness to it, declares the Lord.
Thank you. So, what is the instruction then? What is it that the Lord commands the people to do now that they've been whisked off into exile? When they've been judged, and heck, the people who haven't been taken off into exile, you see that the judgment for them is even worse. But what is it that the Lord is saying they should do? How should life be like for them in exile?
Live a normal life.
Yeah, I mean, it is that, isn't it? Live a normal life, a normal for them life, you know. There's no sense in which he's saying,
Have protest siblings
there's no sense in which he's saying, you know, like, just go along with the flow in Babylon. Like, this is the place I'm putting you and just become Babylonian. That's not what's being described there, is it? Neither is it like, put your life on hold until you get back. he says to them, have a normal life. Build houses, settle down, plant gardens, eat what they produce, marry, have sons and daughters, get them married off so that you may have sons and daughters, increase in number, do not decrease. Does that sound familiar to anybody from any other part of the scriptures? In Egypt, okay, so they were fruitful and they multiplied in Egypt. Anywhere else? Eden. Yeah, especially with the planting of gardens and enjoying its fruit. To be fruitful, to be multiplying, to increase in number. This is supposed to be a punishment. You know, like if we just come in with our, you know, they've done wrong, so God has sent them away. But now they're getting a message from God that actually good is supposed to come from it. That there's to increase in number, that life is supposed to be pleasant, that they're to pursue pleasant lives in this context. Pray for the city that you're in, the places that you are, because if it prospers, well then that's good for you because you're a part of it. It's a bit bonkers really, isn't it? Compared to what we might anticipate the instructions to be. You're to go there, you go to your room and you're going to think about what you've done, and I don't want you to come out until you're ready to apologise. I mean, there is that sort of aspect to it as well. You know, he speaks about coming back to me with all your heart. But Xbox hasn't been banned. You've been sent to your room to, you know, and you've got all the computers you want in your room. Goodness, and all of your favourite books, Becky. Sorry, I should be equal opportunities with my childish pastimes.
He says, pray to me.
Yeah.
Pray to me on their behalf.
Yeah.
Be still with them.
Yeah.
It's not, exile isn't like prison. I think that's the describe it.
Yeah. Mm. Well, it's definitely being away from where they're supposed to be. But God has gone before them. Yeah, God has gone before them. God has gone to prepare a place for them. God is intervening and acting throughout it all. Yeah. I remember I said, when we're thinking about exile, in all of the stories, the things that links it together is that God is achieving something through the exiles. Here's one of the descriptions is that the people would prosper. The people might rediscover their desperate need for him. I mean, that's a hope. Time and time and time again up until this point in the story, when will the people actually get it? Not just in the heat of the moment get it, but like actually get it and live it out in a considered way. Pass that on to their children and their children's children, that you need God and that following him is better. It leads to life. Rejecting him leads to death. Are they going to get that? Well, maybe in exile they will. So that's Jeremiah describes it. Let's flick back to Daniel then. Because we had there Daniel and his mates sort of maybe kicking against the grain. Oh, come on. Yeah. Daniel explicitly references Jeremiah and says towards the end of Daniel, when he's scratching his head about the time periods, because it was in what we just read, wasn't it? 70 years, it said the exile would last. Daniel starts getting sort of like itchy feet and thinking like, well, 70 years is nearly up, Lord, when are we going to go?
So it's recent past though, stuff that
it's present.
he's aware of, but it's kind of
It's
at the front of his mind.
Yeah, Jeremiah keeps on speaking in the years before and the years after the exile. So it's like current affairs stuff for Daniel.
Himself was an old man, wasn't he? He was an old man when he was writing this. Bearing in mind he was then, probably about 80.
Daniel, now, Eva is speaking about, yeah. So, yeah, definitely. So, long and the short of it, we know this story. I'm presuming we know this story. Daniel's appearance and his mate's appearance, not affected by their vegetarian diet. In fact, they look even more handsomer. Yeah, well, there's people who have tried to say the Daniel diet. They're stronger, they're healthier. Let's have a look. verse 18 of chapter 1, at the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. And so they'd stood apart, but at the same time, in a strange way, they'd kind of gone along with the flow. They'd still trained to serve in the king's courts. They'd still were happy to become civil servants. I don't know how you might describe the equivalent. We probably feel really uncomfortable with the description of the group of people that they end up being amongst, the magicians and the enchanters. So what? Is this a story of them standing up and God being there and vindicating them, and so life is good and abundant like Jeremiah describes, or what? Well, a couple of other stories. We've got, Ivor mentioned Daniel with the lion's den. The first story, though, is in chapter 3, and it's not Daniel, it's his 3 colleagues. And there's this rule that goes out in Babylon, that when a particular trumpet is blown, everybody has to stop what they're doing, turn around and bow down and worship, literally worship a statue of Nebuchadnezzar. It is like textbook what you think of idolatry, isn't it? And false worship and what have you. This ginormous golden image of Nebuchadnezzar, and everybody in the entire empire, when they hear the trumpet, is supposed to bow down and worship it. Obviously, that is a step too far. That isn't just life as normal in Babylon, as Jeremiah is describing it, building houses, planting gardens, getting married, having children. This is idolatry. So we have in chapter 3 the story of them standing up against that. These 3 are unwilling to bow down, and they get called out for it, and so they get sentenced to be thrown into the fiery furnace. Chapter 3, verse 13, Nebuchadnezzar's found out about them not listening to this edict that he's got. So he brings them in before him, and he asks them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horns and the flute and the zayah and the lyre and the harp and the pipe and the music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Sort of now sounds more like what I imagine the exile was going to be like. Opposition, hardship. They are the odd ones out. If they're staying faithful to God, then they are going to come under the lens of this paranoid megalomaniac emperor who rules with an iron fist. So what do? Verse 16. One of top 5 statements that humans make in all of the Bible, I reckon. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Meshach, Yorshach, and the bungalow. They replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from it, from your majesty's hand. But even if he doesn't, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." They've said, "You know what? This is a step too far. Even if it leads to us dying, so be it." So be it. The story carries on. They survive in the fire, and there's a 4th person there in the fire with them. Lots of commentators, Christians, believe that it's like Christ there protecting them, keeping them, comforting them. And the king is absolutely amazed. In verse 28, this is what he says at the end of it all. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him, defied the king's command, were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against this God, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. And the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. The person who wanted them to bow down and worship him is now sort of trying to wield his power and authority to make sure that everyone bows down and worships the Israelite God, Yahweh. I think it's an amazing turnaround. And he actually, in chapter 4, writes this notice that's to go out to the entire land. Would somebody read chapter 4, verses 1 just down to 3, and including 3?
King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation.
Stop and think about that. Like, where else have you read, to the nations and the peoples of every language, hear this truth? The God of the Most High God performs miraculous signs. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His reign endures from generation to generation. It's a magnificent testimony. And it's not just one individual to another. It's to the four corners of the known world. To every tribe, to every tongue, to every nation, to all peoples, a witness to the glory of God. Of all the things that, this is just me putting my hand up, you might disagree with me and say that I was daft in the first place, but of all the things that I'm expecting to happen while these people are now cut off from the familiar, away from home, living in exile under judgment for how they've rejected God, I am not expecting the barbaric king who has taken them there to make a declaration like that. Like, I'm not sure that in all the years, the centuries of Israel being a nation, such a declaration was made by someone with that much power. It's astounding. Remember, in exile, God is achieving his purposes. Part of that is judgment, but we know what God's purposes are. It's spreading his glory, it's spreading his fame. And there are lots of places we could have looked at along the way where this is, like the charge that's been given to Israel. We can think about it in terms of the commission given to Adam and Eve, to take the image of God in us and to fill the earth with it. We're supposed to be fame of Yahweh, glory of Yahweh, reputation of Yahweh spreaders. And far from this being like the worst thing that could ever happen, it's just an amazing thing that happens. Every person in this overwhelming empire is being told, oh, by the way, we've just had some new recruits in. Turns out their God's the best God. It's bonkers, isn't it? And it's not just chapter 4, and it's not just Nebuchadnezzar. It's in chapter 6 as well. So Ivor mentioned it. Daniel in the lion's den. There's this opposition. People don't like Daniel because God is with him. He's doing an upright job. He's getting on well. God is prospering him. He's honest. He's not underhand. So they conspire to get him in trouble. They make the king give this silly rule where no one is allowed to pray to anyone except him for 30 days. And Daniel goes, well, looks like I'm going to be in trouble then, because I pray to my God, I think, is it 3 times every day. I open my upstairs window and I pray towards Jerusalem. You know, that sense of that is where God's presence is. I do that, and I'm not going to stop doing that because the king has told me, because like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, if I lose my life, I lose my life. So he gets chucked into a den of lions, sealed in there overnight. King Darius, who knows Daniel, likes Daniel, is disappointed that he's been caught up in this plot by others to get rid of him, sends him into the lion's den, hopes that God gets him out of it, eagerly rushes to the lion's den in the morning, pulls the stone away, and he sees that Daniel is fine. It says this: the king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was lifted from the den, no wounds were found on him, because he had trusted in God. King Darius, verse 25 of chapter 6, wrote to whom? To all the nations and the peoples of every language in all the earth. Bonkers. It's absolutely bonkers. Again, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. Why? Because he's the living God. He endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves and he performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus and the Persians. Again, you know, a different king, same result. This message goes out in the face of persecution, however you want to look at it. This amazing declaration. Daniel knows God's presence with him even there in exile. He is prospered in his life and in his doings, and the good news about God is spread far and wide. So life in exile is a real muddle. It's hard. There's no getting away from that. It's constantly presenting opportunities to compromise and to carry on doing the things that ended the people up in exile in the first place. But it's also not life apart from God. It's away from home, but not apart from God. God is a God who goes into exile with us, if we can think about it like that. Well, we certainly can. We know in Christ that he comes and he suffers in our place. He steps into our guilt and our shame and into our sin. And that actually is possible to prosper when we are living life with God, trusting in God no matter what the environment. And the most amazing thing is that God is using even that judgment that has come on the people to spread his glory and his fame far and wide. So, lots of other stuff happens in Daniel. There's lots of other fun stories and visions and dreams and things like that. But what we're trying to get at is that during the exile, this is what life was broadly like. We've got another example we're going to look at briefly in a second. I've just realised it's 6:10. I thought this was going to be a quicker session, so I apologise for that. But this is broadly speaking what life was going to be like. That even away from home, there's no getting away from God's goodness. I think, Malcolm, one of the weeks you summarised, just like when I said, what have we looked at so far? You said just about how God is being kind or blessing people even when he shouldn't. And that stuck with me, even if those weren't the exact words that you used, because I think you were reflecting on some of the stories in the book of Genesis, that there was blessing people even when he shouldn't. And to me, that's what life in exile seems like, God blessing people even when he shouldn't. seeing his purposes achieved, even when you can't imagine that they would be. So Jeremiah, Ezekiel, they're prophesying, they're writing their books at the time of the exile as well, into that context and beyond that context. And then something happens. I cut us off at the end of 2 Chronicles 36. At the end of 2 Chronicles 36, it speaks about them going into exile until the kingdom of Persia came to power. It has got then this kind of description. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests, the land. So this isn't just about the people. You know, the people had been given the land, entrusted the land. They were supposed to be stewards of it. They hadn't been. So God takes back ownership, if you like, and makes it so that it has its rest. All the time of its desolation, it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. And then in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says. The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has appointed me to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judea. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with you. If you are a member of a rooted group, that'll be familiar with you, because that's how the book of Ezra and Nehemiah starts, with God saying, right, time to go home, working in King Cyrus's heart and making it possible that anybody who wants to go home now can go home. And Ezra and Nehemiah, first of all, it's Zerubbabel and Joshua, then it's Ezra, then it's Nehemiah later. They're like successive waves of exiles who kind of get together and say, yes, we are going to go home, and we are going to go and rebuild the temple. We are going to go home, and we are going to like re-establish the rule and reign of God in our lives. We are going to go home, and we are going to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. Like 3 key things. I think, Ivo, you said at the start that one of the things that happens is that coming out of the exile, not everybody goes home. So some people, life is so good for them that they don't bother going home. And we know that because, well, there's 3 waves going home for a start. If everybody went home, that would only have been 1 wave, but there's 3 waves. And we know not everyone went home in every one of those waves. That an awful lot of people went, do you know what, we're not going to go home. The book of Esther happens after these guys have started making their way home. And so there are still Jews aplenty all over the empire, not Babylonia anymore, but Persia. One, Esther rises to be queen. You can read how God intervenes in that story, and God how rescues, and how actually that story becomes one of the regular festivals, the celebrations in the calendar for Jewish people. Like we as Christians, we've got our holidays, Whitsun and Christmas and Epiphany. I don't know, we've got other posh ones and things like that, and Easter. They've got them, one specifically related to the rescue that God provides in the book of Esther. But Ezra, Nehemiah, stories of the people coming back. Esther, story of the people staying in exile. Haggai, Micah, new prophets speaking into the context of those people coming back. And really, one of the things that we discovered when we were working through Ezra and Nehemiah in rooted groups is that the return is, how can I put this? In body but not in spirit, if that makes sense. So the people go back, the people rebuild the temple, the people start keeping certain laws, the people fix the walls around Jerusalem, but nothing has changed really for them. Nothing has significantly changed between the pre-exile and the post-exile. Their hearts are still just as prone to wander. As quickly as they turn back to God, they turn away from God. Even in the short books of Ezra and Nehemiah, you've got these wonderful times of revival and weeping and recommitment to the Lord, and 9 months later, it's all gone down the drain again. And so the whole of the Old Testament finishes with this, and it's a good couple of 100 years until Jesus arrives on the scene, and it finishes just with this, I don't know, nagging sense that there is something more to be done, that there's something bigger to be done. With hindsight, we can go back and we can read so many of the promises, especially things written by Ezekiel and Jeremiah in this period, that the people going back into the land and doing this, all fine, all good, all nice, but it isn't what God has planned to really put things right. That there's a new covenant coming, there's a new rescue that's going to happen, that there's going to be a new work of God, a spirit that's going to change us from the inside out. And that's where it ends, just waiting for that, anticipating someone, something that's going to happen, who's going to come and put all things right. And that then leaves us with this period that some people call a period of silence. So a couple of 100 years between Malachi, which was the final prophet to speak, or the events of the book of Nehemiah or Esther, which are the last things that we read about happening, and then the birth of Jesus, where there's silence, and from a scriptural point of view, we don't really know much as what's going on. I mean, historically, we do know certain things, significant things that go on. The Persians have obviously taken over, but after the Persians come the Greeks. And one of the really significant things that happen when the Greek Empire kind of expands is that the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, is translated into the Greek language. You might have heard or read about something called the Septuagint, which is the translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, which in themselves only really coalesced and became a solidified thing in people's minds, like, oh, our Bible, in this period between the return from exile and the coming of Christ. That was translated into Greek. Another thing that happened was that the Greeks got taken over by the Romans, and the Romans took over Israel, which is a context that we're extremely familiar with because that's what Jesus lived in, that's what the early church lived in as well. So there was plenty of stuff going on, but that is, if you like, in this story, the end of it until we get to Jesus. So any questions? Any comments people want to make?
Just one comment. You said it
Yeah.
was time of silence, which I understand. But there's a lovely phrase in Malachi, isn't it, towards the end. And then those who feared the Lord spoke with one another, and the Lord paid attention and heard them, and the book of remembrance was written before him. So although there was that time of waiting, when everybody talked,
Yeah.
we talked to one another and said, well, you know,
Yeah.
what is the Lord doing? And when did it happen? And next year and an hour later, say, wow, he's here. So God has his people everywhere, every time. You know, I think we should revision that.
And we call that the remnant,
Yes.
don't we? That in the midst of whatever mass and fuss is going on, there are faithful folk. Because plenty of people who went into exile would have just full beans gone Babylonian. And that's the reason they never came back, because they'd lost it. In Ezra and Nehemiah, you read about lots of people who went too far in their assimilation and they intermarried and what have you. And that's not so much a racial thing as a religious thing, in terms of they'd abandoned, they hadn't stayed faithful to God in the same way as Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego had and what have you. But yeah, there's these faithful few throughout the generations. And it should be said as well that really it's in this period during the exile, as they fought to maintain their identity, and in the period after the return, sort of jump-started through Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and then for the couple of 100 years waiting for Jesus, is when the Judaism that we sort of know and think about, that again, the one that Jesus encountered, really came to be born. All of the people, like the Pharisees, who took seriously like this collection of scrolls they called the scriptures, and thought about how their lives were connected to what God was doing in the world, and if God's promises were going to be kept to and held onto and fulfilled, it was down to them living and things like that. All those sort of ideas and pictures that we've got. Having synagogue in different places in different towns, is all as a result of this, of being dispersed and scattered and then seeking an identity and all of that. So there's a lot of formative stuff that goes on in that period. Even if it's not written about in the Bible, we know, like historically, that there is stuff going on. And in the midst of it, some of it great stuff. In the midst of it, some of it really not good stuff as well.
Because one of the things that happened, wasn't it, that idolatry as had been known doesn't resurrect itself in that form, idol worship. Yes,
amongst the Israelites, amongst the Jews. Yeah, indeed. Amongst the Jews. Yeah. Yeah, of course, we know that there were, as Paul is writing to churches in various places, plenty of statue worship going on, but not amongst the Jews, yeah. If you like, they did learn that lesson in the end. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Anything? No? Cool. Well, we do have one session left, and that is going to be looking at the New Testament. We've done Exile and Return, and then we're going to be AD. So we'll think about Jesus' life and ministry, the early church, its birth and its growth, and caring for and growing believers. Those will be our sections for next month, and hopefully we'll sort of tie up a lot of the threads that we've pulled over the couple of months to see, oh yeah, that makes sense for why things are the way they are, and why Paul writes some of the things that he writes, and why some of the things happen, etc., etc. So I'll pray, and then we'll go home and have a lie down. Lord God, we thank you that you are the sort of God who in all situations is working. We thank you that you don't take time off, that though your people were sent away, Lord God, you were going before them, you were taking care of them, you were actually working beyond them. In those amazing statements from those kings. Lord, we thank you that you are the sort of God who, when we turn our backs on you, when we drift away, when our eyes are more focused on ourselves or our things than they are of you, that you don't leave us or abandon us or forsake us, that you are the sort of God who coaxes us back. You're the sort of God who cares for us and prepares for us to be people who can once again see and declare how good you are, how gracious you are, and how kept we've been. Lord, it's our prayer that as we come to the end of this course, that we would just be more grateful people, not just more knowledgeable people, being able to explain the different movements, the different periods of histories, but in seeing those things put together, we'd be more grateful to you, because it's all the story of what you're up to, of how you're being kind to people who don't deserve it, people who are so like us. Make us to be those grateful people who see your goodness, who see your grace, who see your love, who see your mercy and revel in it, Lord God. Amen.